This is both very interesting but also controversial video because I'm comparing the new Acura TLX to the new Lexus IS, and the camps on both sides are very divided as to which one is a better car. And not only that, Lexus and Acura, or more specifically Toyota and Honda, are actually very different car companies, and you may not be aware of that here in North America. But because I was born and raised in Japan and worked for a number of Japanese companies, including Toyota, I have a very different appreciation of the two brands and the two companies. So before I get into the reason why Acura TLX is actually a better car than the Lexus IS, let me give you just a quick rundown of what makes Honda and Toyota so different. Here in North America, we tend to associate Honda or Acura and Toyota or Lexus at somewhat similar companies, particularly for those people who've never worked for them or who are not from Japan. You think of them as similar companies, and they do in fact compete in some segments very closely. So for example, the RAV4 versus a CRV, or in this case, the Acura TLX versus Lexus IS. So it's pretty obvious that most of us will associate the two brands as being equal and very similar. But that's far from the truth, because Honda, which of course owns Acura, and Toyota, which owns Lexus, are actually quite different cars. Toyota is truly global and mega size in comparison to Honda. And Toyota is very much a customer-driven and a market-driven company, while Honda and of course Acura are very much engineering and technically driven companies. So for example, their business approach and the way they develop and engineer cars are a little bit different. In the management category, if you look at Honda or Toyota, you tend to find more engineers in the Honda side, let's say, than Toyota side. And also the philosophy of how Honda design, engineers, develops, and manufactures cars are very much engineering focused, versus Toyota and Lexus tend to make decisions very much based on market segmentation and where the industry is going. It's not always driven by technical standards. So those are some of the differences. Also, Honda is much more North American based and North American driven. So you might not think of it that way, but many of the Honda and Acura cars are designed, engineered, and built in the US, while for Toyota, that isn't the case. They have lots of cars that are still engineered in Japan and built in Japan. So really, Honda and Acura are very much American product and American company, versus Toyota, which is a little bit more global in focus, and they still have a strong domestic or Japanese influence. So as an example, this Acura TLX is built in the US, but was also engineered and developed in the US, versus the Lexus IS, which was engineered and designed in Japan and still built in Japan. So more on that a bit later on toward the end of the video. But those are some of the differences between the two brands. But let me now walk you through and let you know why the Acura TLX is actually a better car. It's been a fantastic year for those who are looking for sporty luxury compact sedans, as both Lexus and Acura have introduced some fascinating cars. Acura, of course, have this brand new TLX for 2021 with a host of amazing features and performance attributes that makes other automakers look up and notice. At the same time, Lexus has introduced a facelifted and updated IS sports sedan. They have even introduced a V8 version called IS 500, which is shaking up the market. So, which is the better car, the TLX or the IS? Let me explain to you as an engineer why I would pick the TLX over the Lexus IS, even though, as you probably know, I'm a strong, loyal fan of Lexus and Toyota products. In this particular case, the Acura TLX is a better luxury sports sedan. Now, just to clarify, I'm comparing the normal non-performance version of the Acura TLX to Lexus IS. So I'm not going to compare the Lexus TLX Type S to the Lexus IS 500 because neither of the models are out yet and none of us have driven those two. But in terms of comparing the TLX, in this case the A-Spec, to a Lexus IS, that's the interesting question because most of us will be comparing these two when shopping around for sports luxury sedan. Now, this is going to be a very interesting discussion among many of you who are watching my channel because there's a fiercely competitive nature between Acura and Lexus, and especially between the TLX and the Lexus IS. But let me walk you through 5 top reasons why, as an automotive engineer, I think that Acura TLX is a better overall car than Lexus IS. The first reason is an obvious one, and that is the Acura TLX is much more up-to-date than the Lexus IS with more advanced features and better integration between the car and the technology. There is just certain things you can't do when facelifting or simply updating a car like the Lexus IS, whereas when you have a clean sheet of paper, there's so much more you can do. So the Acura TLX obviously has amazing design and styling because it's fresh and new, but inside and also underneath, it has a really good set of advanced features and other items that Lexus IS simply cannot match. So for example, the infotainment system is much more advanced. You get some cool new features like this illuminated lighting system inside the car, and of course the overall design of the entire interior is way more up to date and much more pleasant to look at than the outdated Lexus IS. Of course, whenever you introduce something brand new, it's not always perfect either. So for example, I mentioned in my previous full review of the TLX that I wish that Acura placed the infotainment system much closer to the driver, and so that we can actually operate it just by touch as opposed to using this touch panel, which never seems to work very well. So there's some downside to new technology as well, because there's something about simplicity in the Lexus IS. But generally speaking, all these new features in the Acura TLX is something that Lexus simply can't beat, just because that car is based on a much older design and there's only so much they can do to update that car. The second reason for buying the Acura TLX over the IS is actually the driving feel and the driving experience. I know that the Lexus IS has a really good handling and the overall performance too, especially in the upcoming IS 500 format. With all the engineering they did to improve the ride and handling, there's something very impressive about the IS. But again, when you have a fresh new design like the TLX, the engineer can build in a far better design and geometry for suspension, and therefore improve its handling in a way that the older model cannot do. So when I compare the Lexus IS directly to TLX and drive both cars back to back, well, whether you believe me or not, the TLX does have a better overall handling feel. It has, for example, a little bit faster, quicker steering. It has a little bit more of a planted feel around the curbs, and it has what I call a really good road feel that is not necessarily absent in the Lexus IS, but I think it's a little bit calibrated better in the TLX. Now, if we were to compare the V8 powered Lexus IS 500 to soon to arrive Acura TLX Type S, then that's a fair comparison. Maybe the Lexus IS with the V8 would be a far more interesting car to drive. We just don't know that yet. But when comparing the standard TLX to the IS, I think overall, if you again drive this back to back, you'll find the TLX have just a little bit more fun to drive factor, and everything feels a little bit tighter, and also the driving environment is a bit more pleasant because it's a little bit more airy, a bit more open, and the dash and everything else communicate with you a bit more effectively. So that's the second reason for buying the TLX, is that the overall driving feel and the driving experience is definitely better in the TLX. The third advantage the TLX have over the IS is the fact that this is a larger, roomier, and perhaps slightly more practical sedan. It is definitely bigger, and I'll show you the dimension in a second, and it really shows up in the interior spacing. So neither of the car is a very large sedan by any means, but as you begin to open up and take a look inside, you can tell, first of all, it's much airy inside, as I mentioned a little bit previously, but dimensionally it is more practical and roomier sedan. And I noticed that as I walk into the car and sit down and drive away, it is just a little bit more pleasant space to spend your time, because it's bigger and more comfortable. And I found the seats to be also really accommodating. So the practicality of the TLX is more advantageous than the Lexus IS. I think the IS is a bit small, especially in the rear seat area, and I find that to be a little bit claustrophobic with an older design of the body. But the TLX has a really nice lower dash panel here, very airy, open space, and just a little bit more comfortable space to spend your driving time. So the third reason is that TLX is definitely a bit more practical. If you begin to look at the numbers between the Acura TLX and the Lexus IS, it's pretty obvious that TLX is much more practical. So for example, the cargo volume in the TLX is 13.5 cubic feet, which is pretty decent size. It's also very flat and very usable because this part is nice and tall, so it's very usable. Of course, the seats fold down as well. And then compare that to the Lexus IS, which is 10.8. So it's almost 30% larger in terms of cargo capacity. If you look at the exterior dimension, it's also pretty obvious. The Acura TLX is 194.6 inches long. So it's pretty long car actually, compared to 185.4 inches for the IS. So it's almost 10 inches longer. So in some way, the two cars are actually not in the exact same class in terms of size. The TLX is actually a bit larger than just a mid-size car if you look at the pure numbers. The height is 56.4 versus 56.5, so it's almost the same, but the width is also quite a bit wider. It's 75.2 inches for the TLX versus 72.4 for the IS. So it's full 3 inches wider. So it's not taller, but it's definitely much wider and longer. So once again, the TLX clearly have an advantage because it's simply a larger car. And so if you begin to look at the interior dimension, that's pretty obvious as well. And most notable is the rear space. So the rear legroom, for example, is almost 35 inches in the TLX, and it's only 32.2 in the IS. I did point out the Lexus has a pretty tight rear spacing because it's almost 3 inches smaller in terms of the leg space. And then the front is very similar between the IS and TLX, but there is a much more practical space in the rear, and then a much larger cargo space, simply because the TLX is a larger car. So that's really one big advantage for TLX. If you're comparing to IS, it is probably a little bit more family friendly in terms of carrying cargo and passengers. Another advantage for the TLX, and this is my fourth reason to buy the TLX over the Lexus IS, is that it has, I think it has a better overall powertrain package and numbers as well. So for example, if you were to compare the 4-cylinder TLX to the 4-cylinder IS, then the TLX has 272 horsepower, versus the Lexus IS has 241. So that's a very substantial difference. But the foot-pounds of torque is also quite notable. So the TLX has 280 foot-pounds of torque versus 241 foot-pounds of torque for the IS. So it has almost 40 more foot-pounds of torque. That's substantial difference for the engineer who really do evaluation as a professional living. I can tell you 40 foot-pounds of torque is a huge difference. Now you might argue in terms of price point that the TLX should be compared to the 6-cylinder Lexus IS, And Lexus IS has two different versions of that. They have a standard 4-cylinder, which is turbocharged 2-liter engine. But 6-cylinder is either a 260 horsepower version or the high output 311 horsepower version. So the interesting thing is that TLX standard engine, and the only engine available for now until the Type S comes out, is the 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder for 272 horsepower and 280 foot-pounds of torque, as I mentioned. So that is actually more comparable to the V6 engine in the Lexus IS. The Lexus IS V6 engine is a naturally aspirated engine. It has 260 horsepower in the mid-level version, and it has 236 foot-pounds of torque. And then even the high output has 311 horsepower and 280 foot-pounds of torque. So actually this TLX, even though it's a 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, has similar number as the V6 engine in the Lexus IS. So there is definitely an advantage for Acura again in terms of powertrain. Despite having only a 2-liter turbo 4 for the entire lineup, it has more power and torque than the Lexus 4-cylinder and almost comparable to their Lexus V6 engine. And also, if you look at the fuel economy as well, it's 1 to 2 miles per gallon better. So I think the powertrain performance and the numbers speaks for themselves. It is definitely better than the Lexus IS. Now, of course, you're comparing apples to oranges if you're comparing the 2-liter turbo 4 to naturally aspirated V6 in the Lexus. So that perhaps is not a direct comparison. But just in terms of pure numbers and also the feel of the engine in the actual driving conditions, I think the TLX is definitely better than the IS. So I just gave you 4 reasons why the Acura TLX is so far better than the Lexus IS. But the 5th reason, there's one more reason, and this is a bit of a controversial one because it could go either way. It's either an advantage or possibly a disadvantage. But if you are a North American based person and you want to support cars and trucks being built in the US or Canada, and therefore you want to buy something that's American made, then the 5th reason is a positive thing for you because the TLX is built in the US. Not just built in the US, but Acura and of course its parent company Honda has a really strong engineering group in the US, in their headquarters near Marysville, Ohio. And so this car is really an American product in terms of engineering, design, components, the supplier. So pretty well everything comes within the US. And really it's American product, engineered and designed by Americans. And because Honda is more of an American company than Toyota. But the flip side of the coin is that the Lexus IS in comparison is built in Japan in Tahara factory. I've been to that Tahara factory many times. And so it has perhaps one of the best built quality in the Lexus lineup because that Tahara factory is one of the highest ranked plants in the world. So it's built in Japan, designed and engineered by Japanese Toyota head office people, and all the components and suppliers are also based in Japan. So again, is that a positive thing or negative thing? That's sort of up to you. Again, if you want to support a North American built and engineered product, then Acura TLX has one advantage, and that's my 5th reason to buy the TLX. But if you are a type of person who want to buy a Japanese car because you want it to be built in Japan and you trust the Japanese quality standard a little bit more than the North American built one, then the 5th reason is not necessarily an advantage for you. In fact, in that case, you probably want to buy the Lexus IS instead. Anyways, I just gave you 5 reasons why the Acura TLX is a better car and a better performance sedan than the IS, although I can argue that the 5th point isn't necessarily an advantage. And but it's really up to you to decide which is the right car to buy. They actually serve a slightly different purpose. I know they are compared side by side all the time, but just keep in mind that TLX is a larger car. built in the US, engineered in the US, has a really good performance and has lots of features and advanced items as well. Versus the Lexus IS is a little bit more traditional, built and engineered in Japan. It is a smaller car still with a good performance and absolutely first class body quality inside and out. So those are something to keep in mind. The last thing I will point out to you, and this is for Lexus advantage, I guess, is that when I look at the body quality, the paint job on this Acura, this optional paint, is absolutely fantastic. And the overall quality is also fantastic. But if you look at the gap here, big difference from Lexus IS. The IS is only about a 1 to 2 millimeter width gap, but this one is almost big enough that I can put my small finger through. So again, it doesn't mean the body isn't good. It just means there's a different tolerance and different level of body integrity compared to a Lexus. So it's well built, there's no question about that, but there is some difference and there is some advantage in buying the Lexus IS. So that's a quick summary of the TLX versus the IS. Let me know in the comments below if you want to know more about the two cars, and I will definitely cover those in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'm signing off.